Kermit Alexander was a neighborhood success story. Raised in the Watts area of South Central LA, he had made it out of the projects and into the NFL, playing for the 49ers and the Los Angeles Rams. But soon after retiring from football, his life took a tragic turn that would lead him down a 30-year path of revenge, redemption, and a fight to uphold justice against a member of one of the biggest gangs in Los Angeles. Kermit Joseph Alexander was born on January 4, 1941, in New Iberia, Louisiana. At the age of 5, his parents moved him and his 2 sisters to California with dreams of a better life, away from the segregation laws of the Deep South. Alexander's father got a job as a mechanic and moved the family to the Jordan Downs Projects in Watts, a neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles. After settling in, Alexander's mother and father went on to have 8 more kids, making Alexander the oldest of 11 children. Being the oldest, Alexander had a close relationship with his mother, who was a very religious woman and loved in the community. She cooked food for her neighbors, hosted gatherings at her home, and was known to help everyone, even strangers. All throughout Alexander's childhood, his mother raised him to live this way and taught him that if you can, you should always try and help those who are in need. As a kid, Alexander attended Catholic school and was active in sports. His parents were strict and worked hard to keep him away from gangs and focused on his education. After becoming a star student and athlete at Mount Carmel High School, Alexander was recruited to UCLA, where he became an All-American defensive back, but was considered by many to be the best all-around football player in the nation. In 1963, Alexander was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers with the 8th pick in the first round of the NFL draft. He moved to the Bay Area and played 7 seasons with the Niners before being traded to the Los Angeles Rams in 1970. The trade to the Rams was good for Alexander because it meant he'd be moving back to LA and closer to his family. Alexander remained close to his family his whole time playing in the NFL, and with the money he had made, he was able to put all his brothers and sisters through private schools and move his parents out of the projects and into a new home on the west side of LA. He also made it a point to return to his old neighborhood and give back. It was the early 70s. Watts had changed dramatically in the few years he'd been gone. The 1965 Watts riots had destroyed much of the community, and gangs were quickly growing in numbers. Alexander wanted to give kids from his neighborhood an opportunity to be involved in something positive, away from gangs. So he sponsored a Pop Warner youth football team, the Watts Wildcats, created to help keep kids off the streets. Alexander donated to local youth organizations, hosted charity events, and would take kids from Watts to the Rams games. Even after retiring from football, he continued to help the kids. He was their coach, mentor, and motivator for years, trying to do everything he could do to help, just as his mother had taught him. And although Alexander was able to reach and motivate a lot of kids, understandably, there were some he missed. One of those kids was Tyquan Cox. Alexander first saw Tyquan on the football field in 1974 during a Pop Warner football game. Tyquan was 8 years old and playing for the opposing team as a running back. As Alexander watched Tyquan play, he was amazed at his natural talent, comparing him to a young O.J. Simpson. But as Alexander continued to watch Tyquan play, he noticed he had an angry streak and a quick temper, punching teammates or throwing the ball at refs after a call didn't go his way. Alexander, who had spent years mentoring people, watched the game play out, thinking the whole time that someone should help Tyquan with his anger, teach him how to channel it into something positive. Alexander even yelled out during the game that somebody ought to do something, but nobody, including Alexander, did anything, a decision he would regret years later. Tyquan Cox was from the same side of town as Kermit Alexander, but his life took a much different path. Born on December 1, 1965 in Los Angeles, California, from the very start of his life, Tyquan had it rough. His mother was addicted to drugs and alcohol and was neglectful and abusive. She was arrested over a dozen times for various charges, all before Tyquan was 5. And at the age of 6, he was taken out of her custody. As a kid, Tyquan was described as being quiet but angry, which explains his actions on the football field that day. And as a teenager, all Tyquan saw was violence. He had joined the Rollin' 60s neighborhood Crips and later dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. And in 1980, at the age of 14, he was arrested for carjacking and sentenced to the California Youth Authority facility until he turned 18. While Tyquan was in YA, Alexander was living the life of a retired football player and on his way to becoming an NFL broadcaster. But on August 31st, 1984, 10 years after Alexander first saw Taekwon on the football field, tragedy struck Alexander's family when his mother, sister, and 2 nephews were shot and killed inside of his mother's home. Following the incident, news outlets were on the scene immediately, and the case became front-page news, not only because the victims were family of an ex-NFL player, but because the crime made no sense. Police couldn't understand why Alexander's family would be a target, and they had no suspects, only an eyewitness who saw 2 men jump into a van that was driven by a female.
Sometime in the next few days, it'll really hit me, and I'll try to figure out why, even though it's impossible.
Because LA police detectives had no idea who the gunmen were, theories started to emerge about the potential motive behind the murders. Alexander's family wondered, was it gang violence, drugs, maybe some type of revenge? Eventually, some in the family even started to point the finger at Alexander, believing that he might somehow be involved, since he was a celebrity and more likely to have made enemies somewhere. Alexander also started to blame himself, not because he was involved, but because he had felt he had not worked hard enough to make his mother move out of the house where the shooting took place. It was the same house he had bought her when he moved the family out of the projects, except it had been 17 years since they moved in, and the neighborhood was no longer the peaceful place it once was. Alexander had been trying to convince his mother to move out for years, but she wouldn't. She loved her neighborhood, her friends, and the entire community, and felt it was still a safe place to live. After weeks with no answers, and the police still having no leads, Alexander could no longer take the waiting and decided he would go into the streets of South Central himself to find the shooter. His only goal? Revenge. Armed, he went out day and night talking to everyone, looking for someone who might have heard something about the shooting. He questioned business owners, gang members, pimps and drug dealers, anyone who might have information. Some people he paid, others he begged, and many he threatened. He became a vigilante, out looking to avenge his family's death, and he didn't care if he got hurt or killed in the process. Alexander continued on this way for weeks, making so much noise in the streets that the mayor of Los Angeles called him personally to arrange a meeting. The mayor at the time, Tom Bradley, set up a meeting with himself, Alexander, and the LA police chief. During the meeting, the mayor and the police chief asked Alexander to abandon his revenge mission and allow the police to do their jobs, reassuring him that they were doing everything to find the men responsible for the crime. A month later, during a drug police raid in the Hyatt Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, police arrested a teenager who had been seen throwing a handgun into some bushes. It was later discovered that the teen had just joined the Rollin' 60s Crip gang 2 months prior to his arrest, and that the handgun he was found with was the actual weapon used against Alexander's family. The teenager's interrogation lasted hours, and the police threatened to charge him with the crime if he didn't say where he had gotten the gun. The teen finally admitted that he had been hiding the weapon for another member of the Rollin' 60s, Lil Fee, whose real name was Taekwon Cox. But when police went to find Lil Fee, aka Taekwon, he was already behind bars on a separate weapons charge that had occurred a month before. So on October 25, 1984, Taekwon was rearrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Taekwon was 18 years old at the time of his arrest and had been out of the Youth Authority facility for 10 months. It later came out through witnesses and informants that the 2 other men with Taekwon during the shooting was Horace Burns, who was 20 years old, and Darren Williams, who was 26. And during their trials, the motive for their crime was finally revealed. The men had been hired by a local nightclub owner who was being sued for $2 million by a woman who had been shot and paralyzed at his establishment while celebrating her 21st birthday. The bar owner wanted to eliminate the lawsuit and the people who had filed it, so he paid the men $60,000 to kill the 21-year-old and her family. But on the day of the shooting, Taekwon and his accomplices misread the address that was written down on the piece of paper, and they entered the wrong home. The actual house of the intended target was 2 doors down from Alexander's mother's house. Alexander's mother, sister, and 2 nephews had been killed by mistake. At trial, all 3 men were found guilty. Horace Burns got a life sentence without parole. Darren Williams received a death sentence which was later commuted to 100 years. and Taekwon Cox, who was the shooter, was sentenced to death, becoming the youngest prisoner at the time to be put on San Quentin's death row. The woman who drove the car cooperated with police and testified against all the men involved, receiving full immunity, and no charges were ever brought against the nightclub owner. Up until Taekwon's trial, Alexander didn't realize his mother's killer was the same boy he had seen on the football field 10 years prior. But as soon as he realized, it was a devastating blow. Alexander was overwhelmed with guilt. He felt he should have stepped in all those years ago to help the 8-year-old Taekwon Cox with his anger, and that because he didn't, his family had paid the price. He also still felt guilty for not working harder to get his mother to move out of the neighborhood, and he was hurt and angry that his family had suspected him of being involved. So over the next 15 years, Alexander became a drifter, completely lost in grief and guilt. Estranged from his family, he traveled from place to place, sleeping in his car or in hotel rooms, until he was nearly broke. And Alexander might have continued on this way forever had it not been for his girlfriend Tammy Alexander, who later became his wife. She was able to help Alexander reconnect to the part of himself that enjoyed helping people. Together, the two started traveling to Haiti, a country with a history of extreme poverty. They donated their time and money to help build windmills that generate clean energy sources and bring clean water to the people of Haiti. They also worked to bring food, clothing, and school supplies to the kids there. And 6 years later, in 2010, they adopted 5 children who were living in one of Haiti's orphanages. Slowly, Alexander found his passion for living again. He began to heal and forgive himself and his family, and rebuild a new life with his wife and children. Then, in 2015, Alexander decided it was time to share his story. Together with Alex Gerald and Jeff Snipes, he wrote a book called The Valley of the Shadow of Death, a tale of tragedy and redemption. This was the first time Alexander had ever told his story to the public. In his book, he gives vivid details about the days leading up to the killing of his family. He writes about his downward spiral into depression and what it took for him to turn his life around. But Alexander's story doesn't end there. Today, in his late 70s, Alexander is still in a legal battle with California's courts to get justice for his family. Taekwon Cox has been sitting on death row awaiting execution for over 30 years and has exhausted all his appeals. But due to California's long appeals process, and because of a 2006 federal order that put a hold on capital punishment, Taekwon's case remains caught in the system. Alexander joined a Criminal Justice Legal Foundation lawsuit that would force California to end the hold on capital punishment. But as of today, there is no date set for Taekwon's sentence to be carried out. And even though Alexander awaits that day, when he's asked if he has forgiven Taekwon, he says he has. And he doesn't let anything stop him from continuing his mother's work of helping those in need. Every year he hosts annual charity events that benefit children, and he continues to be a motivational speaker to people of all ages. He tells everyone how important they are and that their life has meaning, and he now says it's become his job to get that message to as many people as he can.